Good. Let me welcome everyone to today's Sakharov Seminar on Human Rights. It's not often that we have poetry presented, but in this particular case, it's fitting. The title is indicated on the first slide, From Disbelief to Dislocation to Rupture, which you can see is categorizing the various stages that poets, and these are Russophone poets in both Ukraine, from both Ukraine and Russia, felt upon seeing the war. And the speaker today is the editor of two, or co-editor of two collections of poetry. She herself is a poet and writer, as well as a senior scholar in literature at the University of Oregon. She put together two volumes, one in English, the other in Russian. And again, it's the original Russian because these were Russophone poets. And we can later speak about how Ukrainian speaking, that is Ukrainophone poets have responded as well. But let me turn it over to Yulia, who will be able to present both the substance of the poetry, the way it was put together, and then some of the major themes. So please, Yulia.
Thank you so much, Mark. I really appreciate it. And thank you, the Davis Center, Alyona Lembersky, and my own university, the University of Oregon Russian and East European Studies. They made it possible for me to make this stop in Boston. And I would like also to thank the authors and translators of both books. I will show them shortly, who are not present here today, but they're present here invisibly.
Spirit.
With their poems and translations. I would also like to thank each and every one of you who are here, and I'm looking forward to the questions and the discussion that will follow. So the books that we put together are here, and have a whole suitcase with books here. So these are the two volumes I'm going to focus on in a short while. And so first, I would like to say that maybe this is an arguable statement, but I think this war, Russia's aggression in Ukraine, has produced the largest body of works as a response to an historical event, the largest in probably the history of world literature. And in a short kind of introduction, I'll explain why and introduce the anthologies. Then I will read the poems from those anthologies. And welcome everyone again. So I'm doing this. No, first, poetry by nature is, it's arguably the shortest path between thought and word. And it is an utterance able to express the inexpressible, in the words of many poets who would say that this is something beyond any other utterance. But also it has very low production costs. So it's an ideal first responder. Any human drama, human tragedy is actually at first, the first response is usually poetry. And there are several area-specific reasons for this incredible outpouring of poetry. So Russia has always been authoritarian. The Russian Empire, for example, was an authoritarian empire where literature and even poetry served as an arena for public discourse. Even Catherine the Great expressed her social views and the plays she wrote for her grandchildren. And in the Soviet Empire, poetry especially successfully replaced religion, which can be seen in, for example, in 1937, when there was centenary of Pushkin's death. And that event was celebrated as a huge religious festivity. It's interesting that poets who were approved by the state and who were pro-government acquired an incredible status. They became, they were very popular. The circulation of their work was incredible. So like millions of copies of their books. And they were eventually, they were perceived as prophets because they were basically the poets, the writers were the arena of public life in Russia. Add to that as school children, we have memorized tons of poetry. At school, we were assigned to memorize poems that are classical, syllabotonic, rhymed and rhythmical. And so each one of us began very early, lots of us, right? Many kids in Russia and in Russian-speaking republics of the former USSR, and even in the diaspora, they begin to express themselves in poetry and understand poetry as a way of expression of anything, right? And so I know that in my school, any teenager in love would write the loved one a poem. And so some loners, unhappy loners, would also express their feelings in poems and consider themselves poets. So this is the Russophone people have this attitude towards poetry, which is pretty unique. Then comes the 21st century. There are several factors. One, there was a thriving literary scene in the fat Putin's years in early 21st century. And there were journals, literary prizes, poetry slams. Everything was very vibrant. And unfortunately, this whole universe is right now, like Atlantis, it's kind of like going underwater because Putin's policies made it impossible for many of the poets even just to stay in Russia or operate. But this whole world, it was so intense, it expanded, and it expanded with social media. Because what is social media for a poet? It's a chance to immediately publish your poet, get an immediate response, and even a discussion. And also the comments sometimes have the discussion of the war itself or the political situation itself. So plus population growth. So I am, my arguable statement about this response being the largest ever response to a historical event in human history might be supported by some of this, but also, of course, when we all notice that when people who deal with poetry in any way notice that everybody who is kind of anthologizing or poetry or is participating in the process as a publisher wanted to capture this. And so capturing this flow was began very early. And another proof of what I was trying to say now is that the very first anthology of the poetic response to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, стихи последнего времени, poetry of the latter days, or doomsday poetry. It was edited by Princeton Slavist Yurii Leving and published with Ivan Limbach House, contained 500 pages of poems written in the first couple of months of this war. And what's interesting, Leving organized this anthology by days. it is hard to find a poet or a poem there, but it's an ingenious idea because it's really capturing the flow. There was also a samizdat, double 2 volumes of Bitter Copper, Gorькая медь, edited by Alexander Frolov. And soon online periodicals began to emerge. One of them is Viewpoint, точка зрения. Currently, it's published by Ukrainian poet Alena Maksakova. The East-West Literary Forum, sorry about that. Yeah, thank you for the water. It's really, really handy. Yeah. This is
By the way, let me just, if anyone would like some of the food back here, please feel free to get up at any time. So please.
Thank you. This is so generous. Thank you, Mark. So if you want to go ahead and yeah, I can wait even a little bit. Yeah. So the East-West Literary Forum, published by Nina Kosman, a poet and translator, and also a Russian oppositional art review. I will go back to it in a short while, but when I was very young, I went to a lecture by Vyacheslav Vsevolodovich Ivanov, a famous culture studies and kind of a culture studies and literature professor at UCLA. He was a student of Vladimir Vernadsky and Teilhard de Chardin, the French philosopher, and he read a lecture about a noosphere, an intellectual cloud that envelopes the earth, just like atmosphere envelopes it. And it's probably the most interesting thing in that lecture was that he said that during the huge tragedies on earth, it's up to poets, philosophers, musicians, and artists to fill the gaps that are caused in that by tragedies. So it was very interesting for me to see that kind of the idea was that the intellectual activity of humans is increasing with tragedies, right? And it was very interesting for me to see this as a metaphorical explanation. But Russian Oppositional Arts Review is a proof to that artistic expression, filling the gaps, filling the voids in that atmosphere, intellectual atmosphere of the earth. A Russian Oppositional Arts Review has art, music, and some philosophical essays, but still poetry is the center of this project, even there. So, yeah. Russian Oppositional Arts Review is published by the wonderful Linor Garalik. She's an Israeli author and also a very important public figure. So, the Kopilka project, Kopilka means coin bank in Russian, began just abruptly, and it is very important for me now, but it began totally at random. I got a message from a friend who asked me to safeguard their poem because that friend was expecting arrest. I just said, of course, and then in a while, it just struck me that this poetry, I could safeguard it because I live in the West and because I participated in Russian literary scene in 1980s and 1990s, also returning to Russia for poetic biennials in the early 21st century. I was part of the New Wave underground movement, the now renowned Kovalji seminar and Poetry Club, Moscow Poetry Club, which made me very I was very lucky to meet all the most important figures of the Russian literary scene, and it just struck me that maybe I should write those authors that I know and ask if they would like to entrust their poems to me. And also I thought that maybe I'm in a position to do something now, and I'll go back to doing something in a short while. But as early as late February 2022, I sent several messages to my friends with a question, «Ты молчишь или кричишь?» which means, are you silent or you're screaming? And the very first poems that I received were at that time in lieu of individual pickets, because pickets were no longer possible after February and early March. I just realized that so many people have those poems, and a lot of them were already on social networks. So I really was shocked by this flow, and I wrote on my a post on my social media on Facebook. I am ready to collect and safeguard protest, anti-war, and anti-Putin poems. And I have 2,000 friends on Facebook, and I think 2/3 of them are poets. And so I got a lot of what we call подборка, small collections of poems. And I also began to take poems from my friends' posts, asking them if it's possible for me to collect them. So this was a Google Doc file, first Kopilka, and then it's a closed database now. In April, I think, I started to have to keep track of it, and it was already several thousand poems from hundreds of poets. This was incredible for me, and I felt that the sheer number of poems made this Kopilka a sign of some kind of protest or resilience. And also, I thought, this is like an incantation. The quantity turned into quality in many ways. It's like an incantation. It's like something that can fight the regime, and I didn't know how. And this would not be possible if the poets were from Ukraine, Russia, and former USSR. If a whole group of translators didn't join me. But let me share some first poems that I got in Kopilka with you, and then I will go to the major translation project that Kopilka turned into eventually. So they say that this poem was written in chalk on those chalkboards in front of some restaurants in St. Petersburg. Have you heard that? This is Vera Pavlova. This poem also demonstrates the difficulty of translation. Одним врут, другим град. И ты, брут, и ты, брат. Слепой крот, пахан блох. Весь мир ждет, чтоб ты сдох. This poem I would maybe ask Mark to read in English. Do you mind, Mark?
No.
Okay.
So the English that's here, I might actually have a slightly different version of English, but I'll rely on the versions here. Tall tales for some scream in pain. Brutus, my son, brother of mine, Cain, which, obviously is put into there for the rhyming of it.
Yes.
Doesn't actually appear there. But anyway, that sightless rat, lord of the lice, the whole world awaits the day he dies.
Thank you. So you see how like I think that it's ingenious, like Lord of the Lies, like Lord of the Flies, right? So this was a way out of this Pahan block situation, actually. It was very difficult for Andrei Buraga, the translator. And then, of course, he had to rhyme because he, this is the expression of rage. So I will go through some feelings that we had at the onset of this Russia's aggression in Ukraine. And one of the major emotions for me was rage. I felt like my hands were shaking. I felt like this is something I needed to express or at least collect. Then another very important emotion was powerlessness. And one of the first poems, and I would just like to pepper my presentation with poems, so there is not much logic in how I will read them in the order I will read them. But this one is by German Lukomnikov, who is in Russia. And when I talked to him recently, he said, please say my name out loud, although some poets are already under initials in our collection. Translated by Dmitry Manin. Это я, Герман Лукомников, не смог остановить сумасшедших полковников. Мои поэтические строчки не спасли ничьего сына, ничьей дочки. Здесь должно быть какое-то продолжение, но я не нахожу подходящее выражение.
Okay. So again, the English version that's here, which I think is a little bit closer this time, but the blame is on me, Herman Lukomnikov, for failing to curb the mad colonels, to call them off. The poetic lines, however well styled, never saved the life of anyone's child, which worked very nicely in English. I feel that this poem needs to continue, but there's no strength left in my mental sinning.
Thank you, Mark. So there is helplessness. There is also person is at a loss, and that's what we were. I kind of till the very last moment thought it was Putin's bluff, and many of my friends did too. So that's why the first book that was published is called Disbelief, because that was the feeling too. And what is also interesting is that German Lukomnikov, he is a minimalist and a poet who resorts very often to non-traditional styles, to short two-lines poems. And here, Lukomnikov, as many others, wrote a syllabatonic kind of logical poem, which I observed as a trend at the beginning of the war. People wanted to be understood. People wanted to go with the flow, basically to repeat that their school, to go back to their schooling and to repeat the classical patterns. Even the most unusual poets, actually, who used very some free verse sometimes, started to write rhymed and rhythmical poems. One of my favorites at the beginning of the war, and it is very important for me to read it now because it's from her poem Gap in Time on Day One. So it is by Irina. Irina is awaiting arrest, so she does not want her last name to be mentioned. This translation is by Josephine Zitsevets, and there will be some more important themes in this poem, but I will first read it. Мой язык как труп, молчит, читает ленту новостей, тает, не в силах просить прощения, просить пощады, просить. Немы волчья сыть.
Okay, so I will go. The Russian breaks up words. It's a little bit hard to replicate in English. However, my tongue silent like a corpse, holds it in, steers holes into the news feed, melts not strong enough to ask forgiveness, to ask here it does break it up. To ask formally to ask, it's not us who are fodder.
Thank you very much. So we wanted to publish the whole poem, but in Dislocation, but we were not able to publish a chunk of text there, so we split it. And I will talk about Dislocation. It's organized by thematic clusters. So this one is in the part that deals with language. Many of us felt that our language was like a corpse, but I think it's brilliantly expressed here by Irina. And another thing that strikes here is that whatever you do, if you are a Russophone person, a Russophone poet who is against this war, you feel some strange complicity or shame or responsibility or guilt. It's just like an array of synonyms that I can come up with. But this was really strange for me. I mean, I immigrated at the age of 26 from the Soviet Union, not even Russia, but still I felt acutely Russian. And this feeling of responsibility was discussed in a post by one of the greatest emigre poets of the 21st century, Alexei Tsvetkov. He, in his post on Facebook, unfortunately, he died that same in the first year of war. And paradoxically, it was a post in prose, not a poetic utterance. Tsvetkov compared the predicament of Russians with that of a person who does not know how to swim, but who is witnessing a child drown. So there is nothing the person can do, really. But if the person does not feel the pain, the grief, and even the guilt till the person dies, this person is not human. So this is something that is in Irina's poem. Another thing that was very important in Kopilka and later in the books that I will discuss was the testimony. There was a very strong feeling among my friends and myself and my family that we are thrown into the flow of history, into the river of history, and we can testimony about our feelings, and we are able to hear testimonies of other people around us. And for me, it was collecting, but for many people, it was this eerie feeling of being inside history. It started even earlier, of course, but the full-scale invasion made it very, very acute. And so this is the poem by Stanislav Belsky, a Ukrainian poet, who demonstrates the feelings of someone who hears the bombardment alarm and slowly goes to the shelter. And what struck me in this poem is not just that it's a testimony, but how a person is basically saved by the power of habit, by noticing small things, and this helps him process the situation and react to it. So, первомартовские хайку. Ночная тревога начинается одинаково. Будет не сирены, их можно проспать, а мамины проклятия Путину. Но дальше есть варианты. Или молния в куртке разойдется, или шнурок в застежке застрянет. Собираюсь в убежище. По привычке пытаюсь убить в коридоре моль. Какой мощный прожектор! Все выбоины в асфальте видны. Нет, это луна. чуть уже старая.
Okay, so this is the March 1st haiku. Air raids always start the same. Waking not to sirens, you can sleep through them, but mom's curses to Putin, or mother's sort of cursing of Putin. But from there on, it can vary. Either the jacket zipper comes undone or the cord gets caught in its clasp. Preparing for the shelter out of old habit, I try to kill a moth in the corridor. With a powerful floodlight, all the potholes in the asphalt are visible. No, it's the moon already waning.
Thank you. Thank you. So you see that there is this habit, he kills the moth running from the bombs, right? Which is so striking. And also he is noticing the waning moon, and his zipper is not working. Those small details are very important, because anyone who dealt with any kind of tragedy knows that the only way out of it, as if like a staircase from the bottom, are those teeny little things that we encounter on the way up. Otherwise, we would drown. When I began collecting those poems, I felt that I could somehow defeat that powerlessness. There was some teeny sense of agency, maybe, and this was striking for me. This was a revelation that I did not expect. And when poets even just sent me their poems, or when I wrote them that I took their poems to Kopilka, they somehow felt validation and even redemption. And later, when the translators started to translate them, the poems got extra lives. Like poem like a cat, right? It has life when it's written, published, translated into one language, another language, it has more than 9 lives, right? If it's translated into many languages. So all of a sudden, there was a teeny hope. And then I recalled one of my favorite articles that was written by Sergei Averentsov in the very beginning of the 21st century, was about theodicy, the justification of God, kind of the redemption of God. And he wrote about rhythm as theodicy. So rhythm somehow was a redeemer in tragic situations for poets. So I thought this could be some way of justifying what's going on. If you're a believer, justifying God. If you're not a believer, justifying the universe in general. It was the way poetry could work. And then later I will talk a little about poetry as a way to conquer evil. So Kopilka would not be anything really but a dead archive if a group of volunteers, translators from the UK, US, and Canada did not join me. And it was such a great thing that we came together as a team, people who knew each other from youth, from childhood, friends of those friends of friends. And so a team of several translators began to work with Kopilka collection. These are Maria Blashstein, Andrei Buraga, Richard Coombs, Yana Kane Esrich, Anna Krushelnitskaya, Dmitry Manin, Josephine von Zitzewitz, Niles Watterson, and also a French translator, Christine Zaytunian, and her group. We were also joined by this wonderful artist, Maria Kazanskaya, who did our covers. She's based in California, and with Andrei Grishaev, who is one of my favorite poets, actually, and also a photographer who also wanted his name to be kept as is, although he lives in Russia. Eventually, those translators started to workshop and discuss every piece we were producing, actually, and later publishing. So what's great about this team is that about half of the people in the Anglo-Russian team are natives of English, and half of them are like myself. They immigrated in their 20s, but we lived in Russia. We know the nuances of the language and some context, cultural context, that we could share this experience, while the UK and US and Canada people who were born there, whose native language is English, were able to help us create poems in their own right, basically English poems in their own right. So the overarching goal was to create, thank you. The overarching goal was to create English poems in their own right, but also to preserve everything, to the style, the sound, the content of the Russian poem or Russian language poem. So we've been working with poets from Ukraine and Russia and the former Soviet Union and the diaspora. And some of those poets, actually, there are some poets here in today. Some even not only help us, some poets translate their own poetry if they live in the diaspora. So some of the poems here are translated by the author, right? Okay, so for us, this was translating and working with Kopilka was part of our resistance and proof of Russia's resistance to the aggression, some kind of redemption, especially of the language, and therapy, of course, because Galina Itskovich wrote a review of one of our books, and she called it Poetry as Therapy. So it was therapeutic, of course, for everyone involved. And it also was a reminder of this conflict to people in the West. And we felt like we were participating in the information war. So here I will do a little incursion about the Z poetry, because anti-war poetry does not exist in some kind of vacuum. There is an unbelievable number of opportunistic poets who are supported by the state, as the state, even at the time of the Soviet Union, it was not so evident that the state supports collaborationists. But those poets are generously supported by Putin's government, and Z means za, which is for the war, and Z and V are the letters signifying this movement. They're bolstered by the state. Their books are distributed, not sold, and actually the quality of this poetry it's almost impossible to compare it with the anti-war poetry. But well, I'll give one example. We have I've mentioned that Atlantis, the world that existed during the first years of the 21st century, with all the slams and prizes and everything. And so none of the Z poets, as far as I know, is a recipient of any prestigious prize. Take like the oldest independent prize is Andrei Bely Prize. Nobody is a recipient of that prize. None of them is a winner of any poetic slams. And most of my friends have not even heard most of the names of those poets. And I will give you, just for a lighter mood. An example of someone, Mikhail Silkin. This is how the Russian state supports those who support it. So Mikhail Silkin is a poet who published 12 collections of pro-war poetry and one anthology of pro-war poetry. I am giving an example of his work on the right. Просто так не выходят в герои, в полный рост за Россию встают, даже землю за родину роют, не в наградах, конечно же, суть. So you cannot become
So,
yeah.
it's almost too disgusting to read. But the chief of a military artistic writers seminar, the central, wait a second, where are we? Okay, I never mind.
Yeah, if you'd like to translate, or we can translate it. It's like you can't.
No, that's all right.
Yeah, we cannot be a hero just so, right? We stand for our Russia, right? We stand tall for Russia. We dig earth for Russia, but it's not about the awards. Something like that. But like встают and суть is a very poor rhyme. Apparently it's a syllabotomic poem, right? And also, of course, I mean, this points to an effort, right? So, yeah, but this Mr. Silkin is, these are his regalia, the chief of a military artistic writers seminar of the Central Club of the Russian Army, named after Mikhail Frunze of Russia's Ministry of Defense, honored worker of culture, laureate of the State Prize, secretary of the board of the Writers' Union, chairman of the admissions committee of the Moscow Writers' Union, honorary citizen of the city of Ryazh and the Ryazan region. So, probably many of you have already heard about this. Gennady Rakitin. Gennady Rakitin was a very popular poet, pro-war poet, who was a semi-finalist for one of Putin's poetry prizes. And probably you've heard that Margarita Simonyan, a Putin ideologue, she said that poetry is our cultural code. That's why probably it's so bolstered, so well supported and paid for by the state. But this was a very famous literary figure, but it turned out that this was a poet created by St. Petersburg, by a group of St. Petersburg poets who translated the poems by Hitler's poets of the 1930s, 40s, right? And these were all patriotic poems, Nazi patriotic poems, and they replaced Germany with Russia and all kinds of organizations with Wagner Group and stuff like that. And in the end, they wrote this poem. Gennady mocked for quite a while the Z poems up on the wall, and in the end, he simply drew a dig for the war. So this is just a very light thing, but I will go back to our anthologies. So this is Non à la guerre, the poetic anthology that was compiled by Christine Zaytounian and her group. It's only in French. And the introduction is taken from one of our books, from this Disbelief book. So, and the materials, the poems are taken from Kopilka, but from the very beginning, for all those anthologies, the principle was that we take the translated poems. So Christine, she took the poems that the French translators liked. So the criteria was that these are the poems that are liked by translators, the poems they spent weeks or even months with. And it was especially important for me because when I was compiling those anthologies, I was very well aware of my very, very strong kind of and personal poetic taste. So I could not just put together the poems I liked. I wanted to put together the poems that would appeal to all kinds of different people. Disbelief, it came on the 1st of January of 2023. And this one, it's also Maria Kazanskaya's cover. It's a woman's face covered with blood drops. How Disbelief came into being, we wrote to several publishers, and 3 of them offered to publish our book. But we immediately fell in love with Andy Croft, the UK publisher, who is also a poet, and his publisher house is putting together poems by poets from all over the world. And he persuaded us that it has to be like this: a Russian poem and an English poem, and they have to mirror each other. He did that with Arabic and Chinese poems as well, because he thinks that this helps even those who don't know the language to understand the poem. And he's very charismatic. He was able to publish the book quickly and very inexpensively. And the only issue that we had with this anthology was actually the biographies in the end of the book. Maria Blastein, who was the de facto editor of this book with me, co-editor, and we were puzzled by how many changes we had to introduce to every biography that we put in the end of the book. The reason was very simple. We started at the very beginning of the invasion. We put the book together, put the biographies in the back, and then there was really an avalanche. People fled Ukraine and fled Russia. So their addresses changed. People stopped writing, fell silent. People changed their names to initials. They wanted to be under initials. People changed their identities even. So, for example, Mikhailo wanted us to, Mikhail wanted us to do Mikhailo, which is like he realized that his identity was Ukrainian, not Russian, because of the war, right? A Russophone Ukrainian poet, Mikhail Yudovsky, who we knew from our youth, he wanted to be Mikhailo. And so people changed their identities even. And of course, we had to change completely the affiliations of and the positions of people. Somebody who was a TV anchor or a prominent journalist, a prominent scholar, would all of a sudden be in a refugee camp in Turkey, in Tbilisi, in Berlin. And so it was an ever-changing situation for us. So in the end, I hope we handled it more or less. But the third anthology came 2 years after Disbelief, and it's also with Maria Kazanskaya's cover. This was published with Slavika. Slavika is a more academic publisher, and it is a larger volume. It has 450 pages, and it is a totally different book and a totally different work for us. The thing is, this incredible outpouring of poetry that we witnessed at the very beginning of the war continued. But first, poets reacted to the developments of this war. They also revisited the old themes that were already in this book. But somehow, with the change of the situation, not only the poet's attitude, but also the reception of the poems changed. Lots of themes were no longer actually powerful enough for people to like them. And some poems that were subtle and had whereas its background were already very powerful at that point. So maybe people were desensitized by, the horrors of the war. And also, Anna Krushelnitskaya and I, as co-editors, we decided that we do not want just to capture this outpouring or collect the most compelling poems as we did here. Those were so powerful that I cried each time I was proofreading the book. But we wanted to make sense of this outpouring, of this flow, surge of poetry. And so we divided the book into 12 conceptual clusters. Each cluster was preceded by a black and white photograph by Andrei Grishaev, which created some kind of East European mood and somber mood, I would say. So you can see this is one of the photos, and one is on the screen, and this is two women trying to photograph Vereshagin's Apotheos Vayni, Apotheosis of War, this famous art piece from late 19th century, Hill of Skulls, right? So, talking about the anthologies first, of course, both anthologies were very hard to compile because it's different from when you, for example, publish your own poems. If there is a mistake, it's all right, like you can survive it. But if it's a mistake in a poem, which is a short utterance, right, and powerful, if in somebody else's poem, it's a catastrophe. So proofreading took like maybe each time it took months. And we are very grateful to translators, of course, proofread their parts, and to Robert Chandler, who proofread, a British translator who proofread it for us, and Dmitry Kuzmin, who checked, he's a public figure and a poet, and he checked all the poets and poems for us. We also, with this, we sourced our poems from not only from the Podborkas, the collections that were sent to us, but also from social networks. But then we asked for permission the first time to place in Kopilka, second time to translate. Then we send the translator to the author. And then we also ask for an additional permission to publish in these books. And this makes real sense. For example, even before the trip that I'm my book tour or whatever, I had to revisit this issue and ask every poet if they would agree to have their names, for example, on the screen, because the situation is changing and lots of our poets are still back in Russia. So the poems are translators' choices. We just, in this case, we just put them into thematic clusters. And in Dislocation, the challenge was actually with those clusters, because each good poem is not about something, it's not devoted to one theme. And to illustrate that, these are the thematic clusters that we have, premonition. And in the brackets, I give an example of how we name those clusters. We decided that naming that like premonition or children at war resistance would be really wrong, because we are dealing with Ukrainians and Russians, with the diaspora and with the former Soviet Union. These are different poets. They have different sense of guilt or rage or language. And so what we did, we entitled every cluster with just a line from a poem that's within this cluster, so that it's kind of subtle and we are not hurting anyone's feelings. And so these are the clusters we have: premonition, grief, face of the war, children at war, resistance, responsibility, rage, language, immigration, cultural implications, theodicy, and hope. And this is an example of how hard it was for us to find niches for poems. This is the Ukrainian poet Olga Bragina. And you will see eventually that this poem deals with many different topics. Наверное, именно так и должны жить одиночки. Каждый вечер приходить в бар кинотеатра страны, язык которой не понимаешь. Нет, конечно, здесь меню евро, бармен и dog-friendly. И чувствуешь себя внутри Вавилонской башни. Чувствуешь себя внутри отсутствия языка. Наверное, именно так и должны чувствовать теперь все мы. Люди на ветру истории. Или есть, или нет. Ты, Бог знает, что тебе скажет Шрёдингер, язык твоего жестокого бога. Отрезал по линии пунктира ножницами тебя. Наверное, именно так и должны жить одиночки. Или есть, или нет ты. Или есть, или тебя каждый раз не понимают. Ты кричишь и ртом немым захлебываешься, как рыба. Но за эту смерть кислорода равно презирать тебя.
Okay, so this is probably exactly how loners should live. Go every night to a cinema bar in a country whose language you don't understand. No, of course, here you'll find words like menu, euros, barman, and dog friendly. You feel that you're inside the absence of language. This is probably exactly how we should all feel now. People on the wind of history, either you exist or not. God knows what Schrödinger will tell you, the language of your fierce God. Use scissors to cut you off at the dotted line. This is probably exactly how loners should live, either you exist or not. You either exist or each time they don't understand you. You scream and choke with your dumb notes, with your dumb mouth like a fish. But for this death of oxygen, you're equally despised.
Thank you. So Anna and I, we were first thinking about the language. Ultimately, it's in the language cluster, but also about, of course, the theodicy, like God, and about immigration. We have a whole section about immigration. So it could be placed in at least 3 different clusters. And you also see from this poem and from Irina's poem that the language is very important. One of the kind of, for Russophone poets, the language is so essential because, for example, the 3 themes of those anthologies, our 4th we thought would be called Rupture. They indicate or probably reflect the attempts of the Russophone poets to distance themselves from Russian cultural context, to distance themselves from the language itself. And it is impossible. It's really like tearing oneself apart, because a poet's language is a poet's tool, right? So doing that, separating yourself from intertextuality, Russian cultural context, from the language itself means killing oneself. And we know the situation of Paul Celan, for example, who had to write in German while Germans killed his whole family in Auschwitz, right? So this is almost unbearable. And although this is the Russophone Ukrainian poet, but it's similarly hard and even more hard for Russophone Russian poets. I'll take 2 more minutes because I wanted to demonstrate a couple more poems, and then we will discuss this. I just thought that this is too hard, right? The material is very, very painful. So I wanted to say that one of the most surprising things for me when I was collecting those poems was that some poems are actually funny, absurd, and even humorous or satirical. And I wanted to demonstrate a poem by one of my favorite modern poets, Yulia Friedman. This is translated by Maria Blastein. The reasons for invading Ukraine are kind of always changing, but they are pretty absurd and they are very interesting. So Putin is offering different explanations, and one of them is that there are biolabs in Ukraine where they are growing some viruses that would kill native Russians. Another is that NATO wanted to invade Russia, and so we had to invade. And the only thing that Putin cannot hide is that it was Russia that invaded Ukraine, right? So the explanations are, there are many of them, but this poem is reflecting that. Когда мы освободили Украину от нацистов, Финляндию от собакоголовых, Польшу от марсиан, земля зацвела кокаиновым цветом душистым, и каждый танкист был магическим воздухом пьян. В Литве окопались улитки с планетной системы холодной красной звезды Ипсилон Андромеды. Скрывались на листьях салата и прочих растений. Пришлось разбомбить все в лепешку, ведь выхода нету. Эстонию тоже снесли с политической карты, поскольку в ней подняли голову ихтиозавры, адепты кровавого культа богини Астарты, приплывшие к нам по орбите от Альфа-Центавры. И в Латвии мы не оставили признаков жизни. А что было делать? Ведь Запад нам выкрутил руки. Он там расплодил вредоносные микроорганизмы, согласно сигналам экспертов от криптонауки. И вот все народы свободны. Нам пишут из рая, и звери, и птицы, и разные меньшие твари. Москва простирается в мире от края до края, от смерча до смерча песчаного в Новой Сахаре.
Okay, so when we had liberated Ukraine from the Nazis, Poland from Martians, Finland from dog-headed men, the earth sprouted fragrant cocaine-smelling blossoms, and our tank men got high on their magical scent. Lithuania became a hotbed for galactic snails. From Epsilon of Andromeda, that cold crimson star, they hid enough. They hid among salad greens and other plants. We bombed a flat, no choice but to go that far. We were compelled to raise Estonia from the map. Since the ichthyosaurs took over step by step, they arrived from Alpha Centauri on an orbital, I can't talk properly, lap. All of them devotees of Astarte's gory sect. In Latvia, too, we destroyed all signs of life. We had no choice. The West forced our hand. It propagated noxious microbes there, as the cryptoscience gurus let us understand. Now all nations are free. They write us from Eden, and all sundry creatures, both furred and feathered, and Moscow extends from horizon to distant horizon, from sandstorm to sandstorm in the new global desert.
Thank you, thank you. This is very hard to read, both in Russian.
Some of these things I'm not familiar with. I have no idea who to start with.
Yeah, so this was one of them. And of course, one last question briefly I wanted to raise is, it is really, a great question is what kind of artistic device you could use when you portray the atrocities of war. And another is who has the right to actually create a poem on behalf of those who experience the atrocities. And some poets sidestep those difficulties by using intertextuality. For example, this is Maria Remizova, who used the famous Mother Goose poem, here, this is the house that Jack wrecked. And she is, I'm not going to read this whole poem, but it's wonderful. It's in this collection. She uses that. This is the house that Jack built. She changes this is the house that Jack wrecked, and then she writes about the death of the dog, the cat, and the old woman, and it's really, really powerful. This is one of the poems I always cry when I read. And another is going into history, and because one of you mentioned that you would like me to read my own poem, this is how I felt safer, because I went as far as the 4th century BC to Qin Shi Huang, the Chinese emperor, who created all those clay figures, the clay army. And at the beginning of the war, I kind of hid behind that, writing a poem that I will read, kind of fulfilling that. «Победим мы или нет?» – спрашивает император Цинь. Отвечает астролог. Все зависит от фазы Луны. Но у нас, говорит Цинь, Луна ушла из страны, а Луну из глины видят только слепцы. Тогда по костям пленных гадать предлагает астролог, по полетам птиц над устьем великой реки. Но всех пленных сожгли, ждать новых придется долго. Птицы стали хитры и не попадают в селки. По предсмертным крикам дев, когда солдаты насилуют их, убивая, говорит астролог, не глядя Циню в глаза. Но чтоб были живые солдаты, девы нужны живые, а у нас все из глины. Без дев больше нельзя. Так говорит император и призывает охрану. Простершись, астролог ползет задом к двери. Его хватают, вырезают сердце, он щупает рану. Ну, сердце, по тебе гадают. Давай, говори. Сердце сжимается, разжимается, сжимается, разжимается. Император Цинь Шихуанди на войну собирается.
Okay, so let me, this, I think the last line there is cut off, but,
Oh, sorry.
are we going to win or not Empress demands? His astrologer says it depends on the phase of the moon, but the moon, Sin says, has already left our lands, and the moon of clay can be seen only by blind men. The astrologer suggests divination by prisoners' bones, by the flight of birds over the great river's mouth. But they've burned all prisoners, and who knows when they'll capture new ones. And the birds learned clever tricks and migrated south by the dying cries of maidens when soldiers rape and maim them. The astrologist says without looking Sin in the eye, but in order to have live soldiers, we need live maidens. And ours are all made of clay. We are running dry. So the empress says, and okay, thank you. Well, let me do it from here I'll add the final line. But in order to have we need live maidens, and ours are all made of clay. We are running dry. So the empress says, and he summons the guard. The astrologer grovels and crawls feet first to the door. Oh, okay. So yeah, there are several lines cut off there. They grab him and cut out his heart. So he touches the grave, I guess. They want you to tell the fortune, speak up, my heart. The astrologer's heart relaxes, contracts, contracts. Qin Shi Huang, dead army, goes on the attack.
Thank you. So, yeah, мертвая армия Цинь Шихуанди на бой поднимается. You know, I think this is a tragic note. So can I read one more optimistic one about resistance and resilience? And then we'll open the discussion. I just realized that It would be very incomplete without this poem. And this is by Natalia Klucharyova, who just left the country. So she's from the city of Yaroslavl. And the Sinaya Square here is not St. Petersburg Sinaya, it's Yaroslavl Sinaya Square. And this is about, I would like maybe to finish with saying that I believe after all this work I've done, and I'm still working on it, I believe in those books where, you know, a teeny little creature resists a huge dark force and wins, like David and Goliath or Harry Potter. Those narratives became real for me. I believe in the small things like poems that will magically somehow resist evil. And this poem gave me so much hope. I think I should finish this presentation with reading this poem about peace protests in a provincial town. Okay. Natalia Кричерева, translated by Andrei Buraga. Мирные акции в провинции выглядят так. 3 девушки, отряд ОМОНа и автозак. Темнеет, зажигаются фонари, зеленоватые, как тошнота внутри. Площадь, седная в прошлом, в настоящем пуста. Прохожий, завидев шлемы, обходит дурные места. В центре города вырастает пустыня, пустошь труда, в чьих незрячих фонтанах лежит неживая вода. 3 девушек бьет пока не ОМОН, но нервная дрожь. У одной на пальто значок. Зачем ты живешь? У второй в рюкзаке не плакат, но альбомный лист. На нем ничего не написано. Он помят и чист. Но даже его развернуть не имеет рука. ОМОН подходит ближе. 3 начинает икать. Задержи дыхание. Я и так не дышу. Над пустыней труда исчезает обычный городской шум. Центр областного центра становится черной дырой. Граждане, вы участвуете. Расходитесь домой. Ну-ка быстро отсюда, я сказал, вашу мать. 3 девушки неподвижны, как памятник. Продолжают стоять.
Okay, so here's how peaceful protests in the provincial town take place. There are 3, and this, by the way, could have been written in the 19th century under Tsarist rule and the 20th century under Soviet rule. But anyway, here's how peaceful protests in a provincial town take place. Not that way, but anyway, there are 3 young women, a paddy wagon, and a squad of police. It's getting dark. The streetlights turn on. Yellow-green glow pours from above, akin to the sickness within. The former Sinaya Square is now an empty lot. People notice the vests from afar and avoid the troublesome spot. The square rapidly turns into barren land. Lifeless fountains sightlessly stare from opposite end. The women aren't hurt as of yet, but they're shaking in horror. One wears a button that says, "What are you living for?" Good question. But anyway, another has in their backpack a crumpled black sheet. But a poster, there aren't any words on it. But even that's hard to unroll. Her fingers are acting up. The police draw close. The third one starts to hiccup. Hold your heads. I can't breathe as it is. Over the barren square, city noises cease to exist. The regional center becomes a black hole. Citizen, and then quotations, citizens, you're taking part. Please disperse and go home. Beat it, I said. Have you fucking heard what I'm saying? the three young women stand still like monuments. They are staying.
Thank you, everybody, and I'm looking forward to any questions. Thank you.
So let me start with one factual question and one question about the composition of the poem. First, you mentioned that I think they had been at least some of the poems have been translated into 5 languages, and I was wondering. I know you mentioned English and French. What else? What other languages were they translated into? And then the question I have is, did any of the Ukrainian poets ask not to be put into volumes with Russian poets? That is, even though they were Ukrainian Russophone poets, they may have felt uneasy about being linked in volumes with Russian poets, especially Russian poets who are still in Russian.
So the languages we have in Kopilka, other languages, we have Hungarian, thanks to Maya Cesarskaya, a wonderful poet and a translator of Russian poetry into Hungarian. We have translations into German, into Ukrainian, and Italian. So the other question is, of course, I didn't have, I had just one situation when a Russophone Ukrainian poet based in Odessa didn't want me to place her poems in Kopilka, but if I asked more people, I'm sure there would be more, because lots of Ukrainians do not want to be in one collection with Russians. So yeah, I'm pretty sure. I don't take it badly. I understand, and I totally feel that I'm with those people who wouldn't like to be to that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Other questions, comments, please speak up.
So I was listening to the poem about the immigration that you're talking about. I didn't see anything about the war. I felt exactly the same way 44 years ago. Identical.
44?
Yes.
When you immigrated?
Yes, when I was traded.
Yeah, we have a large section here about, no, in this one, sorry, about immigration, and it's entitled «По уезжающим ветер течет как кровь». It's one of the quotes from a poem. And it's really, really, I don't even know which immigration was harder, but it is hard, yeah. For now, it's especially hard.
So it's the obvious question. How, so you traveled towards and presented this poem.
Yeah.
So I'm just interested how people are receiving these poems. What do you hear in UK and in the US and different groups?
You know, it started as just people offering me to read my poems. And when Trump started his kind of anti-Ukrainian stance, began, I felt that I need to talk only about the anthologies. And I realized that this was really the right decision because it is the time when people want to hear these poems. And so they really were receptive and were and they liked the poems that I read. I read with different translators, different poems, and each time they resonated. So I'm very grateful for this chance. It's just, yeah.
I remember the first time I saw the book before I met you. It was just a breath of fresh air. It was when the war began. Here in Boston, everybody, at least the English-speaking community, was just full-throated on the side of Ukraine. And so being on the side of Ukraine felt very easy and natural, but it felt you're speaking to a choir.
Yeah.
But the sense was that Russia was an entirely different story. Seeing these poems, for me at least, was just a revelation that there are so many people who feel exactly the same. I think there was a lot of empathy towards Russia. So because of it, restored sense of humanity
Thank you. Thank you.
Why was it a revelation for you? Usually, most Americans always still on the side of the, whoever is attacked, the West region. That's so typical for me.
The revelation that in Russia, there are many, many voices that are against Putin, which we don't hear.
Mhm.
It was not a revelation.
I mean, like every single person who left is against Putin, right?
Not really. I think that, yeah,
The
no,
surveys that have been done show that actually a majority are supporting.
yeah, 80%.
I don't know
yeah.
about support.
Even the people who left are from Putin?
Yeah, many. Mhm.
But certainly, majority supportive of the war. I can't say about supportive Putin. I do have a question about the pro-war poetry.
Mhm,
the
mhm.
Zet poetry. Are there any, because most of it was vulgar, but are there any good poems in it? That is, leave aside the values and the inhumanity of it. Are there any good poems in the pro-war collection?
Could I ask Ilya, maybe you could say
Can I ask you to repeat your question?
if there are good poems in the Z movement?
It's very, for me, it's very difficult to evaluate them only from the viewpoint of quality, because for me, Alexander Nezorov, a prominent Russian poet, was speaking that the poetic form is an ethical category.
Yeah.
For me, if these poems are ethically acceptable, I cannot evaluate them as good poetry. Maybe I am a good. I am not a good judge of poetry, but this is my opinion.
But yeah, Ilya is actually a wonderful scholar of contemporary poetry, in particular, many other things too, and the author of articles about that poetry. So I'm really honored.
For me, this is a kind of recycling of Soviet tradition with the significant transformation, because Soviet tradition was confessed parasitism of the first level, because it was based on misuse and abuse of the humanist tradition and tradition of enlightenment. And here they use the Soviet tradition, removing all the traces of this enlightenment tradition and tradition of humanism, but referring to it as if it still contains these traces of humanism.
Thank you.
Still have time for one more question, if please.
Yeah, I think you mentioned that poetry kind of changed over time by the time the second volume came out. Could you elaborate on that a little?
Yes, I think that there are still poems in that same vein as the ones that we collected in Disbelief, but lots of poems are already, first they're going back to their own styles, but the poets are no longer trying to go to create traditional poems that would resonate. They go back to their styles, and these poems are not only they are reflecting the developments of the war, but they're more subtle. They're more subtle. You no longer can affect that well with a description of atrocities. You have to. Some of the poems that are really powerful and compelling, as I see them compelling, they are already written against the background of the war. Or, for example, they write about the poets write about something like Leni Riefenstahl or some refer to different eras. So they're less direct and straightforward, I would say.
This changing more to
Yes, to contemplation, maybe it would be the right word.
And what about the rupture? Or because you have the disbelief dislocation. Where's the rupture?
Oh, we even thought about calling the third volume amputation. They all reek of surgery, but we thought that amputation was completely off-putting for the readers. Yeah, this means just that poets are tearing with rational understanding of reality, not only with their roots and the culture, but even with some kind of rationality. I think that would be the how, yeah.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Yulia. If there's one more quick question I can take.
There was one, I think,
So-
yes, yeah.
Right here, yes, please.
Thank you. How old are the poets? Young, old, middle age?
So the youngest poet who we have a lot in our collection, and I'm not sure, but for now I will only call him by initials, B, and he's arrested actually right now. So he's
Arrest. under
B,
arrest.
yeah, he is arrested and he's in prison. He was 19 when he was arrested. He's 20 now, and the oldest poets. It's a wide range of. Yeah, we have a spectrum. So.
Okay, very good. Let me thank Yulia for coming and presenting the poetry. If anyone wants to order the books, I'm sure she would be willing to tell you how to do that. And then above all, I want to thank people for coming, especially Yulia for presenting this. Also, Hannah for having arranged the whole thing. Thank you.
Thank you so much.